What if the history you know is only the last chapter of a much longer story? Why does a sealed Ming tomb contain a tiny ring that looks exactly like a Swiss wristwatch? Why does ancient lignite hide an iron block shaped like a machined component? Why do temple walls in Egypt show forms that look like glass bulbs glowing without fire? These are real discoveries, photographed, cataloged, debated for decades. If these mysteries are genuine, then what is missing? The artifacts themselves, or the part of our knowledge that should make sense of them? Official history likes clear timelines. Stone tools belong to prehistory, bronze belongs to early kingdoms, iron belongs to empires. Precision instruments and complex engineering belong to the last few centuries. It is a clean staircase, each step following the one before it. The problem is that the ground rarely cooperates with this neat story. In excavation reports, museum archives, and old field notes, there are objects that do not sit comfortably on any step. A ring that resembles a modern watch appears in a sealed burial from the Ming Dynasty. A block of iron with sharp geometry turns up inside lignite thought to be millions of years old. A crystal lens emerges from an Assyrian palace centuries before optics is supposed to exist. Temple walls in Egypt preserve images that look disturbingly like glass bulbs and cables in spaces where open flame should have blackened every ceiling. None of these finds are secret. They have been photographed, measured, cataloged, published, doubted, and defended. What makes them controversial is not their existence but their implications. If they are taken at face value, they seem to suggest that people in the past either understood more than they are credited for, or that the path of knowledge has not been a simple, uninterrupted climb. Mainstream archaeology responds with caution. It prefers explanations rooted in context, contamination, misidentification, symbolic art, lost local practices, gaps in documentation. That caution is necessary. The past has been abused often enough by fantasies and conspiracy theories, but caution has a cost. When every anomaly is flattened into coincidence, the map of human history becomes tidy at the expense of its most provocative details. The 10 discoveries that follow sit precisely in this uncomfortable space. They do not prove lost super-civilizations or time travelers. They do, however, force a series of questions. How much sophisticated thinking can exist without leaving behind textbooks? How many techniques can rise to local brilliance and then disappear because no one bothered to copy them? And how many times have later generations looked at an object that does not fit and quietly placed it in a drawer instead of in the narrative? This is not a story about magic. It is a story about evidence that lingers and explanations that hesitate, and it begins with something so small that in any other context, it would have been dismissed as a trinket. Here, it becomes the first crack in a very old wall. 1. Swiss watch ring, a modern form in a Ming Dynasty tomb. In 2012, archaeologists working in China opened a burial identified as belonging to the Ming Dynasty. The tomb was described as sealed, with no visible signs of disturbance. In archaeological terms, this matters. A sealed context is supposed to protect time. Objects found inside are assumed to belong to the moment the tomb was closed. During the careful removal of soil near the remains, a small metallic object was uncovered. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, something like a ring, but as the dirt was brushed away, its shape became unmistakable. The object had a circular dial, 2 tiny hands, and a protruding crown on the side. It looked, in every essential detail, like a miniature wristwatch. On the face of the object was an engraving, the word Swiss. The hands were frozen at a precise time, 10:06. The difficulty is not visual resemblance alone, it is chronology. The Ming Dynasty ended in 1644. Swiss wristwatches, as recognizable consumer objects, did not exist until centuries later. Even the idea of Switzerland as a center of watchmaking belongs firmly to the modern era. A watch-like object inside a Ming tomb does not simply raise an eyebrow, it challenges the assumption that form always follows historical sequence. 2 explanations are usually offered. The first is contamination. Perhaps the object was dropped during excavation or slipped into the soil during earlier activity at the site. This explanation is common in archaeology and often correct, but here it collides with the reported condition of the tomb. A sealed burial leaves little room for casual intrusion, and no modern tools or debris were reported alongside the find. The second explanation is misidentification. Maybe the object is not a watch at all, but a decorative ring whose design coincidentally resembles one. This, however, demands an unusual level of coincidence. The dial, the hands, the crown, and the engraved word all align too neatly with a modern reference point. Each feature individually might be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern that resists easy dismissal. Importantly, this object does not prove that Ming-era China possessed modern timekeeping technology. It does not prove time travel, nor does it confirm advanced lost science. What it does prove is narrower and more unsettling. Context is fragile. When an object appears where it should not, archaeology is forced into a defensive posture, explaining why it must be wrong rather than exploring why it exists. The Swiss watch ring remains unresolved. It sits in photographs and reports as a small anomaly with outsized implications. And it serves as a reminder that history is not only written by what fits, but also by what scholars decide to set aside when something does not. 2. Salzburg Cube, Wolfsegg Iron, a mechanical shape in ancient coal. In 1885, near the Austrian town of Wolfsegg am Hausruck, a coal worker split open a block of lignite during routine mining. Lignite is a form of brown coal, formed under geological conditions that predate human industry by an immense margin. Inside that block, embedded within the coal itself, was an object that immediately stood out. It was a compact piece of metal, roughly cuboid in shape. Its surfaces were flat, its edges were sharp. Around its middle ran a clean, continuous groove, as if the object had once been designed to fit into another component. Nothing about it looked accidental. Nothing about it looked geological. The object became known as the Salzburg Cube or the Wolfsegg Iron. When examined, the metal was found to be primarily iron, unusually pure, lacking the irregular composition typical of natural iron nodules. This raised an obvious problem. If the surrounding lignite truly formed millions of years ago, then how could a seemingly manufactured iron object be sealed inside it? Several explanations were proposed. One suggestion was that the cube was a meteorite fragment. This idea was eventually abandoned. Meteorites typically contain nickel and show irregular melted surfaces from atmospheric entry. The Salzburg Cube showed neither. Its geometry was precise, and its groove appeared intentional rather than the product of impact or erosion. Another explanation argued that the object had fallen into a crack in the coal long after the lignite formed, but this too raised difficulties. The mineralization on the cube's surface matched that of the surrounding coal, implying prolonged contact under pressure, not a recent intrusion. For the crack theory to work, multiple geological coincidences would need to align perfectly. What makes the Salzburg Cube unsettling is not just its age problem, but its form. Natural processes produce randomness. Even when symmetry appears in crystals, it follows recognizable patterns. The cube's proportions, angles, and central groove resemble something functional, a spacer, a weight, a component, more than a mineral curiosity. Over the decades, the object was passed between institutions, tested, photographed, debated, and quietly sidelined. No consensus emerged. It was neither fully accepted as an artifact nor comfortably classified as a natural formation. The Salzburg Cube does not claim that humans existed millions of years ago. It does not announce a lost global civilization. What it does is expose a fault line in how evidence is handled. When an object's material context and its visual logic point in different directions, interpretation becomes selective. Coal is supposed to lock time in place, yet here, something shaped like a product of intention appears inside it. The cube remains an unresolved contradiction, less a mystery of origin than a reminder that geology and archaeology do not always tell the same story at the same time. 3. The Nimrud lens, precision optics before optics. In 1850, during excavations at the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud in present-day Iraq, British archaeologists uncovered a small object that did not resemble the surrounding artifacts. Among broken pottery, carved ivories, and architectural fragments lay a piece of clear rock crystal, carefully shaped and polished. It was oval, slightly convex, and smooth to the touch. When held up to the light, it did something unexpected. Objects seen through it appeared larger. This artifact would later become known as the Nimrud lens. The lens is dated to approximately 750 BCE during the reign of King Sargon II. At that time, according to conventional historical narratives, optical technology did not exist. Lenses, telescopes, and magnifying devices are typically associated with much later periods, particularly the Renaissance and early modern science. Yet this piece of crystal behaved exactly as a lens should. Closer examination revealed fine polishing marks on its surface. These were not random abrasions. They suggested deliberate, repeated grinding using abrasive materials, carried out with control and consistency. This level of finish is difficult to achieve accidentally. It implies intention and technique. The immediate question was purpose. Some researchers proposed that the lens was used by Assyrian craftsmen. The reliefs and inscriptions from Nimrud are extraordinarily detailed, featuring intricate patterns and precise lines carved into stone and ivory. A magnifying lens would have made such work significantly easier, especially under low-light conditions. Others suggested a more provocative possibility. The curvature of the lens is sufficient to function as part of a basic optical system. In theory, it could have been used in combination with other lenses or as a component in a simple telescope or viewing instrument. There is no surviving device to confirm this, but the idea itself disrupts the assumed timeline of optical understanding. Mainstream explanations tend to retreat to caution. The lens may have been decorative, it may have been a novelty, or it may have served a limited, practical role without implying broader optical science. These explanations are reasonable. But they concede an important point. Someone, nearly 2,700 years ago, knew how to shape crystal in a way that manipulated light predictably. That knowledge did not come from nowhere. It required experimentation, observation, and transmission. Yet no manuals survive. No diagrams explain the process. The craft appears briefly in the archaeological record and then vanishes. The Nimrud lens does not rewrite the history of science, but it introduces a pause in the story, a moment where precision appears earlier than expected, then fades without explanation. It suggests that technological understanding does not always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it emerges quietly, serves a purpose, and disappears, leaving behind a single piece of crystal to remind us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. 4. The Dendera Light. Images of illumination without fire. Deep beneath the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt lies a series of underground chambers rarely visited by sunlight. Their ceilings are low, their corridors narrow, and their walls densely carved with reliefs that date to the late Ptolemaic period. These spaces were not meant for public display. They were sealed, hidden, and difficult to access. On several walls within these chambers, a peculiar scene appears again and again. A large elongated object dominates the relief. It is bulbous at one end, tapering at the other, and enclosed by a boundary that resembles glass. Inside the shape runs a sinuous form, often interpreted as a serpent. From the base of the object extends a line that connects to a rectangular box. To modernize, the resemblance is striking: a bulb, a cable, and a power source. This imagery has become known as the Dendera light. The controversy does not arise from the carvings alone, but from their environment. The underground chambers show no visible traces of soot, smoke, or burn marks. If oil lamps or torches had been used extensively, especially over long periods, residue would be expected on ceilings and walls. Yet the stone surfaces remain remarkably clean. This absence has fueled speculation. If fire was not the primary source of light, how were these chambers illuminated during carving and ritual use? Mainstream Egyptology offers a symbolic explanation. According to this view, the reliefs depict mythological scenes. The god Harsamtus emerging as a serpent from a lotus flower, representing creation, renewal, and divine energy. The cable is not a wire, but a stylized connection between concepts. The box is not a power source, but a symbolic pillar or shrine. This interpretation fits comfortably within known Egyptian religious iconography. It does not require unknown technology. It preserves continuity with other mythological scenes carved across temples. Yet the visual similarity remains uncomfortable. The enclosed shape, the internal form, and the apparent connection to a device-like base align too closely with modern expectations of artificial light to be ignored entirely. Engineers and technicians who encounter the reliefs often remark that they look less like metaphors and more like schematics. The Dendera carvings do not prove that ancient Egyptians used electricity. No wires, generators, or bulbs have been found. But the question they raise is narrower and more precise. How much of ancient symbolic language do modern observers dismiss too quickly as purely metaphorical, and how much might encode practical knowledge in unfamiliar visual forms? The reliefs sit at the boundary between interpretation and projection. They remind us that ancient art was not created for modern viewers. When we look at it through modern eyes, we may see machines where none exist, or we may fail to recognize techniques whose logic has been lost. In either case, the Dendera light forces a confrontation with uncertainty and with the limits of confident explanation. 5. Lovelock Cave, when legend and excavation collide. In the arid desert of Nevada, tucked into a rocky hillside near the town of Lovelock, lies a cave long known to the local Paiute people. For generations, the cave existed not as an archaeological site, but as a place of warning. Oral traditions spoke of a hostile race of giants who once lived there, tall, powerful beings with light-colored or red hair who preyed upon the Paiute and were eventually trapped and destroyed inside the cave. For outsiders, these stories were dismissed as myth. That changed in the early 20th century. In 1911, miners entered Lovelock Cave searching for bat guano, valued at the time as agricultural fertilizer. As they dug deeper, they uncovered layers of ancient deposits. Soon, baskets, tools, woven mats, and duck decoys began to emerge. Artifacts far older than the mining operation itself. Archaeologists were called in, and formal excavations followed. More than 10,000 artifacts were eventually recovered, many of them remarkably well preserved due to the cave's dry conditions. But alongside these objects were human remains that sparked immediate controversy. Some skeletons were reported to be unusually large, with estimated heights exceeding those typical of known Native American populations. Even more striking were reports of hair that appeared reddish or reddish-brown in color. Local newspapers seized on the story. The details echoed the Paiute legends too closely to ignore. Scientific responses were cautious. Later analyses suggested that hair color can change after burial, lightening or reddening due to environmental conditions. Skeletal measurements were reinterpreted as falling within human variation. Over time, official summaries downplayed claims of giants, and the more dramatic interpretations faded from academic discussion. Yet something unresolved remained. Many of the largest bones reportedly disappeared into private collections or museum storage, never subjected to comprehensive modern analysis. Early excavation methods were inconsistent by today's standards, and documentation was often incomplete. As a result, the record itself became fragmented, part data, part rumor, part silence. Lovelock Cave occupies a difficult position in archaeology. It is neither a clear hoax nor a confirmed anomaly. Instead, it represents a collision point between oral history and institutional science. When indigenous accounts align unexpectedly with physical finds, the question is not whether legends are literally true, but how much historical memory can survive without written records. The cave does not prove the existence of giants. It does, however, demonstrate how easily certain narratives are filtered out once they challenge established frameworks. What remains is an incomplete picture, a site rich in artifacts, layered with stories, and burdened by gaps that can no longer be filled. Lovelock Cave reminds us that archaeology is shaped not only by what is found, but by what is preserved, published, and permitted to remain part of the story. 6. Barbagal Watermill Complex, an ancient factory without electricity. Near the modern city of Arles, in southern France, lie the remains of a structure that, at first glance, does not look mysterious at all. There are no strange symbols, no anomalous artifacts, no legends attached to it. And yet, in terms of engineering and organization, it may be one of the most revealing sights of the ancient world. This is the Barbagal watermill complex. Built during the Roman period, likely in the 2nd century CE, Barbagal consisted of 16 water wheels arranged in 2 parallel rows cascading down a hillside. Water was fed from an aqueduct at the top, then passed from one wheel to the next in sequence. Each wheel powered a millstone, grinding grain continuously as long as water flowed. Shawl. In modern terms, this was not a single machine, it was a system. The layout reveals intentional design on an industrial scale. The mills were standardized. The flow of water was carefully regulated. The entire complex functioned as a coordinated unit, capable of producing large quantities of flour, enough to supply tens of thousands of people. This was not an experimental installation or a local curiosity. It was infrastructure. What makes Barbagal remarkable is not that the Romans used water power. That fact is well known. What is remarkable is the concentration and integration of power generation. 16 wheels operating together, arranged for efficiency rather than simplicity, reflects a mindset closer to modern factory planning than to small-scale ancient craft. There was no electricity, no steel gears, no automation in the modern sense, and yet the logic is unmistakable. Energy was captured, distributed, and converted into mechanical work through a repeatable process. Output was predictable. Maintenance would have been routine. Downtime could be managed by isolating individual components. This challenges a common assumption about ancient technology, that it was clever but limited, impressive in isolation but lacking systemic thinking. Barbagal demonstrates the opposite. It shows that ancient engineers were capable of designing complex production environments when social and economic conditions demanded it. Why then did such systems not become more widespread? One answer lies in economics. The Roman world relied heavily on slave labor, reducing the incentive to mechanize beyond certain thresholds. Another lies in fragility. Large systems require stable administration, maintenance, and peace. When those conditions collapse, so does the infrastructure. Barbagal does not suggest lost technology, it suggests lost priorities. The knowledge to build something like this existed. What disappeared was not the ability, but the context that made large-scale mechanical organization worthwhile. In that sense, Barbagal is not an anomaly buried in mystery. It is a reminder that technological potential can rise, stall, and vanish, not because it was impossible, but because history moved on. 7. The Baghdad Battery, an object that invites a modern function. In 1936, during excavations near Kujut Rabu, close to modern-day Baghdad, archaeologists uncovered a small ceramic vessel unlike most others from the region. It was unremarkable in size and shape, but its contents raised immediate questions. Inside the pot was a rolled copper cylinder, and within that cylinder sat an iron rod. The components were isolated from each other by asphalt-like material. This configuration became known as the Baghdad Battery. The object is typically dated to the Parthian or early Sasanian period, roughly between the 2nd century BCE and the 3rd century CE. On its own, each component is familiar to archaeologists. Together, however, they form a structure that closely resembles a simple galvanic cell. When modern researchers recreated the setup and filled it with a mild acidic solution, such as vinegar or wine, the device produced a measurable electric current. This experiment did not prove that the original object was intended as a battery, but it did establish something important. The design is capable of producing electricity without modification. This is where the debate begins. One Chumai interpretation suggests that the device may have been used for electroplating, possibly to deposit thin layers of metal onto decorative objects. Electroplating requires only small currents, well within the range produced by such a setup. No surviving plated objects have been definitively linked to this method, but the idea remains plausible. Another interpretation is more conservative. The vessel may have served a ritual or storage function, with the metal components unrelated to electrical use. Archaeology often encounters objects whose parts are misassembled by modern observers seeking familiar patterns. The difficulty lies in intention. Unlike tools with obvious wear marks or inscriptions, the Baghdad battery does not declare its purpose. It sits in a gray zone where function must be inferred, and inference is where modern bias easily enters. What makes the object valuable is not the claim that ancient cultures used electricity in a modern sense. It is the fact that the configuration exists at all. Someone assembled ceramic, copper, iron, and sealant in a way that accidentally or deliberately creates an electrical potential. That alone challenges the assumption that such arrangements would be unthinkable without modern theory. Knowledge does not always arrive with equations. Sometimes it arrives through practice, observation, and trial. The Baghdad battery remains unresolved because archaeology prefers restraint. Without direct evidence of use, no definitive claim can be made. But the object continues to provoke interest because it demonstrates how thin the line can be between coincidence and capability. In the ancient world, many techniques may have existed without formal explanation. When the explanation is lost, only the object remains, and with it, the temptation to ask whether the past understood more than it recorded. 8. Zheng Heng's seismoscope, detecting the invisible. In the year 132 CE, during China's Eastern Han Dynasty, a scholar named Zheng Heng presented a device to the imperial court. At first glance, it did not look dramatic. It was a large bronze vessel, circular in form, decorated with dragon heads positioned evenly around its exterior. Beneath each dragon sat a toad, its mouth open. This device was designed to do something extraordinary: detect earthquakes. According to historical records, when a distant earthquake occurred, one of the dragon heads would release a small ball into the mouth of the toad below it. The direction of the falling ball indicated the direction from which the seismic waves had arrived. In other words, the device did not merely sense that an earthquake had happened. It identified where it had happened. This was Zheng Heng's seismoscope. What makes the seismoscope remarkable is not the dragons or the symbolism, but the underlying idea. Earthquakes are invisible forces. They cannot be predicted by sight or sound. Zheng Heng's device attempted to translate subtle ground motion into a clear mechanical signal. It was, in essence, an early sensor. Modern reconstructions suggest that the mechanism likely relied on inertia. A suspended mass inside the vessel would remain momentarily stationary as seismic waves passed through the ground, triggering a mechanical linkage connected to one of the dragon heads. The concept is sound, even if the exact internal design remains debated. Skeptics point out that no original example of the seismoscope survives. Our understanding comes from historical descriptions, not physical remains, but those descriptions are detailed, and they come from a culture with a strong tradition of bureaucratic record-keeping. The device was reportedly tested successfully, even detecting an earthquake hundreds of kilometers away that was not felt in the capital. This places Zheng Heng's invention far outside the common narrative of ancient science. The idea that a pre-modern society could design an instrument to detect unseen natural forces challenges assumptions about the limits of early engineering. It shows an understanding not just of materials, but of behavior, how objects respond to motion and resistance. The seismoscope does not imply modern seismology. It did not measure magnitude or predict events, but it reveals a mindset that is unmistakably scientific. Observe a phenomenon, isolate its effect, and build a mechanism to register it reliably. That mindset is often assumed to belong to much later periods. Zheng Heng's device suggests otherwise. Here, technology did not advance because of industrial demand or military pressure. It advanced because someone wanted to understand the world more precisely. The seismoscope stands as evidence that curiosity, when paired with mechanical insight, can produce tools that feel modern even when they are nearly 2,000 years old. 9. The dioptra, measuring the world with precision. Long before modern surveying instruments existed, ancient engineers faced a fundamental problem: how to measure space accurately. Roads had to remain level. Aqueducts had to maintain a precise gradient over long distances. Cities had to be planned with geometry, not guesswork. To solve this, the Greek and Roman world developed an instrument known as the dioptra. The dioptra appears in texts as early as the 3rd century BCE and is described in detail by later engineers, including Hero of Alexandria. At its core, it was a precision measuring device. It allowed the user to sight along fixed axes, measure angles, establish straight lines, and calculate elevation differences. In principle, it performs functions strikingly similar to those of a modern theodolite. The instrument consisted of a mounted viewing tube or aligned sights, often placed on a rotating platform. Adjustments could be made with fine control, enabling repeated, consistent measurements. Some versions incorporated graduated scales, while others relied on calibrated alignment and leveling techniques. This was not an improvised tool. It was designed for accuracy. The existence of the dioptra explains something often overlooked. Large-scale ancient construction did not succeed through intuition alone. Roman aqueducts, for example, maintained gradients of only a few centimeters per kilometer over vast distances. Such precision is impossible without reliable instruments and a culture of measurement. What makes the dioptra feel modern is not its materials, but its philosophy. Measurement becomes an abstract process. Space is no longer estimated by eye, it is quantified. Angles, distances, and slopes are translated into numbers that can be checked, corrected, and replicated. This shift marks a critical moment in technological thinking. No single dioptra has survived intact. Like many tools, it was likely dismantled, recycled, or lost. But its descriptions persist, embedded in engineering texts rather than myths or legends. This matters. It shows that precision instrumentation was not an accident or an isolated curiosity. It was part of a professional tradition. The dioptra does not suggest forgotten super technology. It suggests something subtler, that the foundations of modern engineering, standardization, repeatability, and accuracy were already understood in principle. What changed over time was not the idea of measurement, but the scale at which it was applied and preserved. When modern observers underestimate ancient engineering, it is often because they imagine builders working by feel. The dioptra reveals a different reality. The ancient world measured first, built second, and trusted instruments more than instinct. In that sense, this quiet device represents a turning point, one where the world became something that could be measured rather than merely observed. 10. Archimedes' screw, a machine that refused to disappear. In the 3rd century BCE, a Greek mathematician and engineer named Archimedes described a device so simple, so effective, that it has remained in use for more than 2,000 years. It consists of a helical surface wrapped around a central shaft, enclosed within a tube. When rotated, it lifts water upward in a continuous flow. This device became known as Archimedes' screw. At first glance, it appears almost too basic to be remarkable. There are no gears, no complex linkages, no hidden mechanisms, and yet this simplicity is precisely what gives the screw its power. It converts rotational motion into steady, reliable vertical transport with minimal energy loss. Even by modern engineering standards, the design is elegant. In the ancient world, the screw was used primarily for irrigation. It allowed water to be lifted from rivers and canals to higher ground, expanding agricultural capacity without the need for large animals or complicated infrastructure. Later, it found use in drainage, mining, and flood control. What makes Archimedes' screw extraordinary is not that it worked once, but that it kept working everywhere. The same basic design appears across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and later in medieval and early modern Europe. Materials changed, power sources changed, human labor was replaced by animals, then by motors, but the core geometry did not. This persistence is rare. Most technologies evolve rapidly or disappear entirely. They are replaced by more efficient systems, or abandoned when the knowledge required to maintain them fades. Archimedes' screw did neither. It survived because it solved a fundamental problem in the most direct way possible. From an archaeological perspective, the screw presents a different kind of challenge. It does not raise questions about lost civilizations or misplaced artifacts. Instead, it raises a question about knowledge transmission. Why did this design survive when so many others vanished? What allowed it to cross cultural and historical boundaries intact? The answer likely lies in visibility and utility. The screw's function is immediately understandable. Its construction does not require specialized materials. Its effectiveness can be observed directly. It teaches itself through use. This stands in contrast to more complex systems, which require training, documentation, and institutional support. When those supports collapse, so does the technology. Archimedes' screw demonstrates that ancient engineering was capable of producing solutions so well matched to their purpose that they became timeless. It is not a relic of lost knowledge, but a survivor of it. And in that survival, it quietly challenges the assumption that progress always means replacement. Sometimes the best design is the one that never needs to change. What the past refuses to explain. The 10 discoveries in this series do not point to a single hidden civilization or a secret chapter of forbidden knowledge. They point to something more difficult to accept. History is uneven. Across different cultures and eras, people solved problems with the tools, materials, and understanding available to them. Sometimes those solutions were limited and fragile. Sometimes they were precise, sophisticated, and surprisingly durable. And sometimes they appeared briefly and then vanished, leaving behind objects that feel out of place to later generations. What connects these discoveries is not mystery for its own sake, but context. A watch-shaped ring matters because it appears in a sealed tomb. A metal cube matters because it sits inside ancient coal. A lens matters because it shows deliberate optical shaping long before optics became a field. A factory matters because it shows industrial thinking without industry. A screw matters because it endured when so much else was lost. In each case, the question is not whether the past was secretly modern. It is whether modern narratives are flexible enough to account for variation, loss, and discontinuity. Knowledge does not move forward in a straight line. It branches, stalls, concentrates, and sometimes collapses. When that happens, what survives is not always what was most advanced, but what was most resilient. Archaeology does not lack evidence, it lacks certainty. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion available. The past does not owe us clarity. It leaves fragments, objects, systems, and ideas that force us to choose between comfort and curiosity, between closing the case or admitting that some questions remain open. In the end, these discoveries do not demand belief, they demand attention. Because history is not only what we understand, it is also what refuses to be neatly explained.